Hey guys, tonight we step into a cottage that smells faintly of smoke, sweat, and something else. Something older than dust, older than fear itself. There's a single candle guttering on a rough wooden table, and the body laid out beside it is already cooling. A woman wails softly in the corner. A man in rags sits at the foot of the corpse, tearing a piece of coarse bread into small, trembling bites. He doesn't speak to anyone. He doesn't look at the family. He just eats, slowly, solemnly, as if the act itself hurts. You've stumbled into the forbidden ritual of a sin eater, a peasant hired to consume a dead person's sins, bite by bite. And you probably won't survive this story with your appetite intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments, because I'm always curious who's wandering through the dark with me tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air in that cottage is thick, almost edible. You can feel the superstition hanging around like damp linen. A few villagers hover at the doorway, pretending not to watch, but they can't look away either. No one wants to be too close to the sin eater. It's said that once he finishes, the sins of the dead, everything foul and regretted, pass into him. He becomes heavy with other people's darkness. And yet without him, the dead might wander in purgatory forever, their souls restless and unshriven. It's an impossible job, necessary and shameful at the same time. Like being the village's spiritual sewer. You can almost hear the logic behind it. Better one man damned forever than a dozen souls trapped halfway to heaven. That's the kind of thinking that makes sense when you live in a world where plague, hunger, and bad harvests are constant reminders that life's fragile and divine mercy feels negotiable. The ritual is simple, but every gesture is loaded with dread. The bread sits on the chest of the corpse, sometimes beside a cup of ale, sometimes a bowl of salt. The sin eater murmurs a few words, half prayer, half incantation. Then he eats the bread, drinks the ale, and leaves without another word. The family pays him a few coins, maybe less than a day's wages, and then scrubs the table after he's gone, just in case. Nobody shakes his hand. Nobody says thank you. He's performed a holy blasphemy, and everyone knows it. The strange thing is, this custom existed for centuries in pockets of Britain and Wales, though the church officially condemned it. Historians have traced mentions as far back as the 17th century, but many believe it's older, a leftover from pagan funerary rites. Back then, people believed you could transfer sin or misfortune through objects, bread, water, even the air around the dead. Eat the bread, take the sin. Wash the hands, wash the soul. It's spiritual physics, medieval edition. One quirky account from Herefordshire describes a sin eater who insisted on using beer brewed from barley grown on consecrated ground. A creative loophole, he said, to keep his digestion safe. Whether that actually worked is debatable. Most of these men didn't live long, or at least not well. People whispered that their eyes looked strange, as if they'd seen what no one should see. Some even claimed they could smell the sin eater coming, like burnt sugar and rot. Historians still argue whether the ritual was more symbolic than literal, maybe just a bit of theater to comfort grieving families. But when you watch that man chew in the dim light, it doesn't feel like theater. It feels like survival. His, theirs, and maybe yours too. You start to notice how the room itself participates. The flickering shadows, the low ceiling pressing down, the sound of wind moaning through the cracks. It's all part of the performance. A world that believes in invisible burdens needs someone to carry them, and the sin eater's empty stomach makes him perfect for the job. He finishes the last crumb, wipes his mouth on his sleeve, and stands. For a moment he sways, like he's dizzy from what he's just taken in. Then, without a glance at the corpse, he leaves through the back door into the fog. The family begins to pray again, relieved. To them, the dead is clean now, freed. You follow him out into the night. The fog curls around your legs, cold and whispering. Somewhere in the darkness, the man's shadow fades, and you can't help thinking, who eats his sins when he dies? That question lingers longer than it should. And before you know it, you're walking the same path he took, deeper into the old hills, where hunger and holiness sometimes share the same spoon. You follow the dirt path down into the hollow, where the mist thickens and the silence grows almost tangible. It's the kind of silence that holds memory, of bells that no longer ring, of prayers that never reached their mark. The sin eater's footsteps are gone now, but you can still feel the echo of them beneath your own. Before you can understand why anyone would agree to swallow another person's spiritual filth, you have to travel back to the root of it all, to the fear of dying dirty. In the medieval imagination, sin wasn't an abstract concept. It clung to you like soot on skin. Every lie, every lustful glance, every missed prayer left a residue. Death didn't wash it away. The church promised that confession could, but confession required a priest, and priests weren't always around, especially in plague years or in small villages tucked behind miles of mud and mountains. So when someone died suddenly, unshriven, unconfessed, their soul was in limbo. Not damned, not saved, just waiting. You can picture it. A poor family gathered around their dead father, terrified that his spirit might hover nearby, unable to move on. They'd heard sermons about purgatory, that grim halfway house where the unclean were burned clean through suffering. They couldn't stand the thought, and so they did what desperate people always do. They improvised. Sin eating was born not from theology, but from terror, from the raw peasant fear that something unseen could still harm the living. The act was part ritual, part bribe, part magical thinking. Bread, after all, was sacred. It was the body in the Mass, a vessel of forgiveness. If a priest's consecrated bread could cleanse a soul, maybe a peasant's bread could at least keep a ghost quiet. In some villages of Wales and the Welsh Marches, people whispered that the sin eater came from beyond the hedge, a poetic way of saying, not one of us. He lived apart, near the edge of fields, where the church bells barely reached. He wasn't evil exactly, but uncanny, like a man who'd stepped too close to the other side and somehow come back. One quirky detail. There are accounts suggesting sin eaters would sometimes eat salt from the corpse's chest before the bread. The salt, they said, drew the sin out of the body. The bread merely contained it. It's ritual logic, layered like bad folklore lasagna. You can imagine the gossip. Don't let him near your child, or he'll swallow their soul by accident. Don't share a meal with him. His breath carries curses. And yet, when someone died suddenly, who did they call? Always him. Because better the outcast than the restless dead. The irony is rich. The same society that banished the sin eater depended on him completely. It's a strange mirror of the way people still behave. We reject what disgusts us, then rely on it in secret. Garbage collectors of the soul, these men were hired shame. Church authorities, of course, hated the practice. It violated nearly every tenet of Christian doctrine. No man could take away another's sins, only God could. But these were centuries when church dogma and peasant survival coexisted awkwardly, like two guests who refused to make eye contact. And besides, most priests weren't keen to walk miles into freezing countryside just to bless a body that had been lying there for 3 days. Historians still argue whether sin-eating originated from pre-Christian ancestor rites or from later Christian superstition. Some think it may have started as a metaphorical meal of mourning, a symbolic act of solidarity that eventually turned literal as belief hardened. The truth is lost in the fog of oral tradition, somewhere between a half-remembered song and a folk charm muttered under breath. You picture a world where every illness was a message from heaven, every strange noise in the night a spirit unsettled. The church could thunder from the pulpit, but people's daily lives were ruled by things smaller, older, and far less forgiving, like weather, hunger, and shame. So when someone offered to eat a loaf of bread and carry your loved one's sins into the grave, what choice did you have? You'd hand over the coin. You'd avert your eyes. You'd tell yourself it worked. Because believing was cheaper than despair. The village would go on, pretending the sin-eater didn't exist until the next death, until another body needed cleansing, until another soul hovered too long at the window. And each time the ritual felt a little more normal. The next time you see it happen, you're close enough to smell the bread. It's coarse barley loaf, hard, dry, the kind that needs ale just to go down. The body on the table is that of a young shepherd, his hands still calloused, his face slack with peace that feels borrowed. His mother's eyes are red from weeping, her knuckles white around a wooden rosary. The sin-eater sits beside the corpse, head bowed, and everything in the room slows to a whisper. This is the unholy meal. There's no priest here, no Latin chant, no holy water. Just a plate, a cup, a muttered exchange that sounds like someone rehearsing an apology. The bread rests on the dead man's chest. A candle trembles. The sin-eater closes his eyes, places a hand on the loaf, and begins to speak in a voice that feels too steady for what he's doing. He murmurs, "I give easement and rest now to thee, dear man. May all thy sins be forgiven, both in body and soul, for I have eaten and drunk of thy transgression." Then he eats. Slowly, deliberately. You can hear the scrape of his teeth on crust. Each bite sounds louder than it should, like the room itself is flinching. The family stands motionless, part reverence, part terror. The logic behind this act is both beautiful and grotesque. Bread is vessel, flesh for flesh. The ale cleanses, the bread absorbs. When he swallows, the sin-eater symbolically takes in every moral blemish the dead might have carried, lies, envy, lust, cruelty, and digests them so the soul can rise clean. It's a strange inversion of communion. Instead of consuming the divine to become pure, he consumes the impure to become damned. It's the world turned inside out, but it makes perfect sense if you live where theology has holes big enough to fall through. After he finishes, the sin-eater drinks the ale, wipes his mouth, and stands. No one thanks him. No one offers more. In many accounts, he would then step outside and say a few words to the night, as though speaking directly to the dead. "Go thy way in peace. Thy sins be taken from thee." And that's it. The ritual ends not with fanfare, but with silence. The kind of silence that sits heavy for generations. One actual record from 1686 describes a sin-eating in Herefordshire. The writer called it a barbarous custom, lately observed, of one eating a loaf of bread laid upon the chest of the deceased, thereby pretending the absolution of all his crimes. You can almost hear the disapproval dripping from the ink. And yet, the fact that someone took the time to record it means it happened often enough to bother the pious. But there's another layer. One that's almost tender. For all its heresy, sin-eating was a gesture of compassion. It gave the grieving something tangible to hold on to. In a world where medicine failed, crops died, and children vanished into the next fever, the idea that something could be done, anything, was powerful. Some scholars argue that sin-eating may have evolved from funeral feasts, ancient gatherings where food was shared with the dead, symbolically bridging the living and the departed. Over time, that communal meal narrowed to a single eater, a scapegoat figure, absorbing sorrow for everyone else. It's like the village poured its collective guilt into one man, wrapped it in ritual, and called it mercy. A quirky local tale from the Welsh border tells of a sin-eater who refused to eat pork, claiming swine and sin mix poorly in the gut. Another swore that the more sins he ate, the heavier his body became, until he could barely walk. He believed the weight of souls dragged him toward the grave. Historians still argue whether this was mere folklore or the psychology of shame taking physical form. But when you imagine eating sin for a living, every day carrying invisible burdens nobody else dares touch, you start to believe heaviness can be real. The mother in the cottage crosses herself. The candles sputters. The sin-eater leaves quietly, coins clinking in his palm. Behind him, the family begins to sing a hymn, soft and unsteady, like they're trying to fill the hole he's left behind. You linger for a moment, watching the breadcrumbs on the table. There's something sacred about their ordinariness. The act is finished, but the story isn't. Because every ritual, no matter how strange, has a cost. And soon, you'll follow the man who pays it. You follow him into the cold dawn. The fog has lifted just enough to reveal the shape of the hills, the crooked fences, the world still half asleep. The sin-eater walks with a limp, his coat patched in 5 different shades of gray, his shoulders hunched like he's perpetually bracing for something heavier than rain. You'd think a man who frees souls might walk taller, but no. Every step seems to sink a little deeper. He's heading home, or whatever home means for someone no one wants near. His cottage sits at the farthest edge of the village, beyond the last marker stone where the land begins to turn to wilderness. The roof sags under moss. The door is barely holding. No smoke curls from his chimney. He probably can't afford the wood. Inside, it smells of damp earth and loneliness. Here's the bitter irony. The sin-eater saves everyone but himself. Villagers rely on him, but they treat him like a living curse. They don't invite him to weddings or feasts. Their children are warned not to look at him too long, in case their sins leap across. When he passes, people lower their voices and make the sign of the cross, just to be safe. Still, when someone dies, they send for him in secret. They leave a few coins on the doorstep, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, and wait. No one ever speaks his name aloud. It's safer that way. You imagine the thoughts that fill his nights. How many sins has he eaten? How many whispered confessions has he swallowed with stale crumbs and sour ale? At what point does a man start to wonder whether the sins stay in him forever, or whether they eventually start whispering back? There's a story told in Radnorshire about a sin-eater who kept a ledger, a small, greasy book listing the names of those he'd cleansed. One winter, he was found dead beside it. The book's last page simply read, "Oh, fool." People said his heart burst from the weight of what he'd taken in. Others swore they saw ghostly lights above his grave, as though the souls he'd consumed were finally escaping. It sounds like folklore, but then again, so does everything, until it isn't. The social paradox of the sin-eater runs deep. He was simultaneously vital and vilified, a man performing a role the church refused to acknowledge, yet the community couldn't do without. It's the same pattern you see even now in quieter ways. The nurse who cleans the dying, the worker who buries the waste, the ones who touch what others fear to face. In one recorded 18th century case, a sin-eater demanded double payment if the dead man had been wealthy, claiming rich souls rot slower. He didn't live long after that. Villagers accused him of greed and drove him out. The line between sacred service and sacrilege was razor thin. And yet, despite everything, these outcasts kept at it. Why? Maybe because the job gave them a strange kind of power. For a few moments, everyone needed them. For a few minutes, even the devout whispered, "Let him work." A quirky tidbit from a Welsh folktale says sin-eaters could smell sin the way a dog smells fear. They'd pause outside certain homes and mutter, "Not yet, but soon." You can see how that wouldn't make you popular in a small town. Historians still argue whether sin-eaters believed in their power or simply played their part. Were they true believers, martyrs of mercy, or opportunists cashing in on grief? The truth probably lived somewhere between faith and hunger. When you're starving, belief can be a meal in itself. He sits at his rickety table, counting his coins, 3 coppers, a bent nail, and a button someone slipped in by mistake. He doesn't curse. He just sighs, eats what's left of the bread, and drinks the last of the ale. The same ritual, this time for himself. Outside, the village bell rings. Another death. Another summons. He pauses, wipes his mouth, and rises again. It's a grim kind of immortality, one that ensures he's remembered not for who he was, but for what he took away. And somewhere in the valley, mothers tell their children, when you hear the wind moan after dark, that's the sin eater, still hungry. You trail behind him as the bell tolls again, slow, deliberate, the sound of duty dressed as mourning. The village gathers near the chapel this time, a stone building so old that moss has learned its hymns by heart. The priest stands at the door, his hands folded, eyes lowered. You'd think he might stop what's about to happen, but he doesn't. He just turns slightly away, pretending not to notice. That's the strange truth of it. The sin eater existed in the space between church and shadows. The church condemned the act publicly, but privately, well, silence was easier. For the clergy, sin-eating was an embarrassment, a superstition that clung like smoke no sermon could disperse. But for villagers, it filled the gaps faith left open. Where doctrine failed, fear improvised. The priest watches as the sin-eater walks past him, eyes downcast, avoiding the holy water's stoup like it might burn. He isn't invited inside. Instead, he circles to the back door, where the dead man's family waits. They don't meet his eyes either. They just nod toward the body laid out near the hearth. The ritual begins again. Bread, ale, muttered words, a small exchange of coins, a big exchange of silence. You can feel the tension humming between sacred and profane. The church teaches salvation through confession, repentance, absolution. The sin-eater promises a shortcut, a home remedy for the soul. One bite, one drink, one man's damnation for another's peace. It's easy to see why the church hated it. It undermined everything it stood for. But in the remote borderlands of Wales and England, bishops were far away, and death was always close. So people hedged their bets. They went to Mass and hired a sin-eater. A little divine insurance never hurt. There's a local saying recorded in an old parish note. A priest blesses the living, but a sin-eater frees the dead. You can imagine how that went over in Sunday sermons. Still, most priests quietly allowed it. Better the sin-eater swallow superstition than let panic fester. After all, nothing disrupts the peace of a parish quite like rumors of a soul wandering unshriven. You start to notice how these beliefs survive precisely because they're never written down. They thrive in whispers, in corners, in the hush between one prayer and the next. It's folklore's version of an underground stream, hidden but always flowing. One quirky historical note. In some 17th century burial records, families added cryptic phrases like, "all ceremonies duly observed." Historians suspect that was polite code for, "yes, we hired the sin-eater." Even paperwork tiptoed around the truth. The sin-eater finishes the ritual and steps outside again, wiping crumbs from his beard. The priest, still standing near the chapel, finally looks up. Their eyes meet for the briefest second, a flicker of recognition or pity or maybe shared guilt. Then the priest turns away, adjusting his robes like nothing happened. This uneasy coexistence between faith and fear wasn't unique. Across Europe, the church had long wrestled with folk rituals it couldn't quite stamp out. Charms for childbirth, blessings for cattle, candles against storms. Sin-eating was just another one of those half-heresies that refused to die because it worked, at least in the imagination. Historians still argue whether the church's tolerance was strategic or simply resignation. Some say priests turned a blind eye out of compassion. Others think it was convenience. Why confront your flock when their superstition helps them sleep at night? And maybe that's the point. Belief isn't about what's true. It's about what quiets the fear of what might be. The sin-eater's shadow stretches long in the twilight. He walks past the chapel graveyard, where names blur on lichen-covered stones. You wonder if he's buried there too someday, or if they'll dig him a pit far beyond the boundary where consecrated soil refuses his company. He pauses at the gate, glancing back only once. It's a small, human gesture, tired, almost tender. Then he disappears into the woods, where even the church's voice grows faint. And there, between faith and the forgotten, the ritual lingers on. Half prayer, half hunger, echoing through centuries like a breath held too long. So now, the candle gutters low, and the story exhales its last quiet breath. You're still in that small, cold cottage, the one where it all began. The bread lies untouched this time, a few crumbs softening in the waxlight. Outside, the night is patient, the world almost still. You think of the sin eater, how he walked through life half-seen, carrying what no one else would bear. In the hush between wind and memory, you can almost hear him still, his footsteps fading over moss and mud. Maybe he wasn't a monster or a saint, but something smaller, sadder, more human. A man trying to make sense of sin in a world that never stopped sinning. It's strange, isn't it? How much of our comfort depends on someone else's discomfort. How even the purest ritual carries a trace of fear, a whisper of hunger. You wonder whether the bread ever truly cleansed anyone, or if it only made the living feel better about what they couldn't change. The candle flame bends once more, shivers, then steadies. You exhale with it, slow and easy. Maybe tonight's story isn't about death at all. Maybe it's about what we do to feel forgiven, how we build our own tiny ceremonies against the dark. And maybe somewhere, a sin eater finally sleeps without dreams. Good night.